Nebraska, 1923. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wheat fields as Sarah Mitchell stepped onto the porch of her farmhouse, coffee steaming in her hands. At 28, with auburn hair that caught the light like spun copper and eyes the color of summer corn, she embodied the strength and grace that prairie life demanded. Her calloused hands told the story of countless mornings milking cows, afternoons tending gardens, and evenings mending clothes by lamplight. What she couldn't know as she watched her husband Thomas emerge from his workshop, oil-stained apron tied around his waist and that familiar spark of invention gleaming his dark eyes, was that in just 3 hours, everything would change forever. The life they had built together on their 160-acre homestead would be shattered in a moment of mechanical violence that would test not only their love, but the very limits of human ingenuity and determination. But this story isn't just about tragedy. It's about what happens when love meets innovation, when devastating loss becomes the catalyst for breakthrough discovery, and when two people refuse to let circumstances define their future. Sarah Mitchell would lose both her arms in a threshing accident that should have ended her independence forever. Instead, it would begin a journey that would revolutionize medicine and prove that the human spirit, when combined with brilliant engineering, knows no bounds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Mitchell farm sat nestled in the rolling hills of Lancaster County, Nebraska, where the soil ran black and rich as chocolate and the horizon stretched unbroken in every direction. Thomas and Sarah had purchased the land 3 years earlier, with money saved from Thomas's work as a mechanical engineer for the Burlington Railroad. Their farmhouse, painted white with green shutters that Sarah had insisted upon, stood as a testament to their shared vision of a life built on honest work and mutual respect. Sarah had grown up on a farm 20 miles south, the daughter of Swedish immigrants who had taught her that land was the most honest living a person could make. Her father, Lars Anderson, had been a man of few words, but infinite wisdom about soil and seasons. Her mother, Astrid, had possessed hands that could coax life from the most stubborn garden plot and hearts from the most reluctant dough. When consumption had claimed both her parents during the harsh winter of 1919, Sarah had sold their farm and carried forward their lessons about the dignity of agricultural life. Thomas Mitchell was a different sort entirely, born in Chicago to parents who ran a small machine shop. He had grown up surrounded by gears and pistons, learning to read mechanical drawings before he could properly read books. His mind worked in blueprints and equations, seeing solutions where others saw only problems. While other boys played baseball in the streets, Thomas had been in his father's shop, crafting small inventions from scrap metal and discarded parts. Their courtship had been unconventional. They had met at the Lancaster County Fair in the fall of 1919, where Sarah had been exhibiting her prize-winning preserves and Thomas had been demonstrating a mechanical corn sheller of his own design. She had been drawn to his quiet intensity, the way his face lit up when explaining how his machine could shell twice as much corn in half the time as traditional methods. He had been captivated by her practical questions about efficiency and maintenance, her genuine interest in understanding not just what his invention did, but how it worked. Most folks see a machine as either working or broken, Thomas had told her as they walked between the exhibition booths that evening. You see it as something that can be improved. Their marriage 6 months later had combined her agricultural knowledge with his mechanical genius in ways that made their farm remarkably productive. Thomas had designed and built improvements for nearly every aspect of their operation. A windmill-powered water pump that irrigated their vegetable gardens with unprecedented efficiency, a modified hay rake that cut their harvest time by a third, and a cream separator that produced butter so smooth and rich that the general store in town specifically requested. Sarah's dairy products. The farmhouse itself reflected their partnership. Sarah had designed the layout for maximum efficiency in food preparation and preservation, while Thomas had engineered innovations that made their daily work easier. A pulley system allowed Sarah to raise and lower heavy pots in the kitchen without strain. Clever mechanical assists helped with everything from churning butter to grinding grain. Their cellar featured Thomas's design for a cooling system that kept vegetables fresh well into winter. But it was in Thomas's workshop, a large building he had constructed behind the main house, where their collaboration truly flourished. Here, surrounded by lathes and drill presses, workbenches covered with precisely organized tools, and shelves lined with reference books on engineering and mechanical design, Thomas worked on inventions that extended far beyond their farm's needs. Sarah had become his unofficial research partner, testing prototypes and offering insights about practical applications. Her farmer's understanding of real-world conditions helped Thomas refine his designs, eliminating theoretical solutions that wouldn't survive contact with mud, weather, and the daily demands of agricultural life. Together, they had developed several innovations that Thomas had begun patenting, with dreams of establishing a small manufacturing business that could serve farmers throughout the region. Their latest project was ambitious, even by Thomas's standards. A revolutionary threshing machine designed to process grain more efficiently while being safer to operate than existing models. Traditional threshing machines were dangerous devices, with exposed gears and belts that had claimed fingers, hands, and occasionally lives from operators who got too close to moving parts. Thomas's design enclosed all moving mechanisms and included multiple safety features that would prevent accidents. Every farmer in Nebraska will want one of these, Sarah had said just the week before, watching Thomas make final adjustments to the prototype. "It's brilliant, Thomas. Truly brilliant." The machine represented months of careful engineering and construction. Thomas had studied existing threshing equipment, identifying every potential failure point and safety hazard. His design featured covered belt systems, emergency stops within easy reach of operators, and guards that prevented operators from accidentally contacting dangerous moving parts, while still allowing efficient grain processing. Sarah understood the machine's operation as well as Thomas did. She had helped test each component as it was completed, learning to recognize the sounds that indicated proper function versus potential problems. Her natural mechanical aptitude, sharpened by years of maintaining farm equipment, made her an invaluable testing partner. Thomas trusted her judgment about the machine's practical applications completely. The morning of October 15, 1923, dawned clear and crisp, with just enough frost to silver the remaining grass, but not enough to damage the late vegetables still growing in Sarah's garden. It was perfect threshing weather, dry enough to ensure clean grain separation, but cool enough to prevent overheating of mechanical components. Thomas had spent the previous evening making final calibrations to the threshing machine, adjusting belt tensions and verifying that all safety mechanisms functioned properly. Sarah had helped, holding parts steady while he tightened bolts and tested moving components. They had both been excited about the day's planned full-scale test, which would process several bushels of wheat they had set aside specifically for evaluating the machine's performance. "Today we find out if 3 months of work was time well spent," Thomas had said over breakfast, his enthusiasm evident in the way his hands gestured as he described the testing procedure they would follow. Sarah had shared his excitement. This machine represented not just Thomas's engineering skills, but their joint understanding of what farmers actually needed. If the test proved successful, it could launch the manufacturing business they had dreamed about, providing income that would allow them to expand their farm and maybe eventually start the family they both wanted. The testing plan was methodical, as Thomas's approaches always were. They would begin with small batches of grain to verify basic operation, then gradually increase the load to test the machine's capacity and efficiency. Sarah would monitor the grain input while Thomas watched the mechanical components for any signs of stress or malfunction. As they walked toward the workshop that morning, Sarah felt a contentment that had become familiar over their 3 years of marriage. This was the life she had envisioned when she had sold her parents' farm and agreed to Thomas's proposal. Partnership in its truest sense, two people combining their different strengths to build something greater than either could achieve alone. The workshop smelled of machine oil and fresh-cut lumber, scents that had become as comforting to Sarah as bread baking in her kitchen. Sunlight streamed through windows Thomas had positioned to provide maximum illumination of work areas, and the morning air carried the crisp promise of a perfect autumn day. Thomas began his pre-operation inspection of the threshing machine, checking each component according to a written checklist he had developed. Sarah prepared the wheat they would use for testing, measuring it into precise quantities that would allow them to evaluate the machine's processing efficiency accurately. "Everything looks perfect," Thomas announced after completing his inspection. "Ready to make history?" Sarah smiled, adjusting her work apron and pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Ready," she said, not knowing that within minutes, their carefully planned future would be destroyed, and their real journey, the one that would test every ounce of their love, determination, and ingenuity, was about to begin. The threshing machine hummed to life with the smooth, efficient sound that Thomas had engineered into its operation. For several minutes, everything proceeded exactly as planned. The machine processed grain cleanly and efficiently, separating wheat from chaff with mechanical precision that exceeded their most optimistic projections. But on this perfect autumn morning, as Sarah reached toward what she thought was a routine adjustment that she had made dozens of times during testing, a single bolt one Thomas had checked and rechecked chose that moment to fail. The safety guard that should have protected her from the machine's most dangerous components swung open with a violence that would change their lives forever. In the space of a heartbeat, Sarah Mitchell's world shifted from the promise of invention and partnership to a reality of unimaginable loss. But this was only the beginning of their story, the moment when love would be tested by tragedy, and when two remarkable people would discover what they were truly capable of achieving together. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sound that Thomas would never forget wasn't the mechanical grinding of metal against bone, or even Sarah's initial cry of shock. It was the sudden, absolute silence that followed, the moment when the threshing machine's steady hum ceased, when the morning birds stopped singing, when even the wind seemed to hold its breath in the face of catastrophe. Sarah stood motionless beside the machine, her face pale as winter wheat, staring down at where her arms had been just seconds before. The safety mechanism that Thomas had designed, tested, and trusted with his wife's life had failed at the precise moment when failure meant everything. A single bolt, weakened by metal fatigue that no amount of inspection could have detected, had given way under stress, allowing the guard to swing open and exposing the machine's most dangerous components just as Sarah reached forward. "Sarah," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible in the sudden stillness. He had seen industrial accidents during his railroad workmen caught in machinery. Lives changed in instants, but nothing had prepared him for this moment when the woman he loved more than life itself stood before him. Forever altered by his own creation, Sarah's legs gave way, and Thomas caught her before she could fall, his mind already racing through emergency procedures even as his heart shattered. Blood loss was the immediate danger. He had to stop the bleeding, had to get her to medical help, had to somehow undo what couldn't be undone. Working with the mechanical precision that had made him an excellent engineer, Thomas applied tourniquets using his belt and rope from his workbench. His hands moved with practiced efficiency while his mind screamed in anguish. Every motion was deliberate, calculated to save Sarah's life, even as he grappled with the knowledge that he had built the machine that had destroyed her. "I'm going," To get you to Doc Harrison, he said, lifting Sarah into his arms with a gentleness that belied his desperate urgency. Everything's going to be all right. But even as he spoke the words, Thomas knew that nothing would ever be all right again. Not in the way it had been. The life they had built together, based on partnership, shared work, and Sarah's capable hands that could coax life from soil and bread, from flour, had ended the moment that safety guard failed. The race to town became a blur of dust and desperate prayer. Thomas had hitched their fastest horse to the buckboard in record time, creating a makeshift bed in the wagon where Sarah could lie as still as possible during the jolting journey. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her face growing paler with each mile, while Thomas pushed their horse harder than he had ever dared. Dr. Marcus Harrison had been Lancaster County's only physician for 12 years, arriving fresh from medical school in Chicago with modern ideas about antiseptic procedures and surgical techniques that had initially mystified the local farmers. Over the years, he had proven himself capable of handling everything from difficult births to traumatic injuries, earning the community's trust through competence and compassion. But when Thomas burst through his office door carrying Sarah's unconscious form, even Harrison's professional composure cracked. "Dear God," the doctor breathed, immediately clearing his examination table and calling for his nurse. "What happened?" "Threshing machine accident," Thomas managed, his voice raw from shouting at the horse during their frantic journey. "Safety guard failed. She's lost. She's lost both." Harrison was already examining Sarah, his trained hands checking for signs of life-threatening blood loss, while his mind calculated treatment options. The tourniquets Thomas had applied had been correctly positioned and had likely saved Sarah's life, but the massive trauma she had sustained would require surgery beyond anything the small-town doctor had ever attempted. "We need to get her to Omaha," Harrison said grimly, working to stabilize Sarah for transport. "The surgical hospital there has specialists who have experience with amputations this severe." The next 12 hours passed in a haze of train stations, medical consultations, and waiting rooms that smelled of carbolic acid and despair. Thomas sat beside Sarah's hospital bed in Omaha, watching her pale face and listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing, afraid that each breath might be her last. Dr. Jonathan Westbrook, the chief surgeon at Omaha General Hospital, was a man who had seen the worst that industrial accidents could inflict on the human body. He had trained in Boston and Philadelphia, learning the latest techniques in reconstructive surgery, but even his extensive experience provided little comfort as he examined Sarah's injuries. The amputations were traumatic but relatively clean. He explained to Thomas in the hallway outside Sarah's room. "The tourniquets you applied prevented her from bleeding to death. That quick thinking saved her life." Thomas felt no pride in the compliment. "But the damage is extensive. Both arms severed just above the elbow. We've done what we can to clean the wounds and prevent infection, but—" Dr. Westbrook paused, choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Mitchell, your wife will survive, but she'll never again have the use of her arms. The implications for her independence, her ability to care for herself." The doctor's voice trailed off, but Thomas understood perfectly. In 1923, losing both arms meant a lifetime of dependence on others for the most basic tasks. Eating, dressing, bathing, everything that defined adult autonomy would be beyond Sarah's reach. Women in her condition typically became invalids, cared for by family members until death released them from their helplessness. When Sarah finally awakened 3 days later, her first words were not about pain or fear, but about the farm. "The harvest," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the surgery. "Thomas, the corn needs to be brought in before the first freeze." Thomas took her hand, or rather, he placed his hand where her hand should have been, over the bandages that covered the stumps of her arms. "Don't worry about the harvest. The Johnsons and the Carlsons have been helping. Everything's being taken care of." Sarah turned her head to look at him, and in her eyes, Thomas saw not self-pity or despair, but a clear-eyed assessment of their new reality. This was the woman who had helped him design safety mechanisms for farm equipment, who had worked beside him in the fields from dawn to dusk, who had never backed down from any challenge their life together had presented. "Show me," she said simply. "Show you what?" "Show me what I look like. I need to see what we're dealing with." Dr. Westbrook, who had been adjusting her medical chart, looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Mitchell, perhaps you should wait until you're stronger." The shock of seeing ... "Doctor," Sarah interrupted, her voice gaining strength, "I'm a farmer's wife. I've seen injured animals, difficult births, and death in all its forms. I need to understand my situation completely so I can start figuring out how to live with it." The courage in her voice broke Thomas's heart and filled him with admiration simultaneously. When the bandages were carefully removed and Sarah saw the reality of her condition, she was silent for a long moment. Then she looked directly at Thomas. "The machine you built, was anyone else hurt?" Thomas stared at her in amazement. "Sarah, you're worried about other people? You've just lost both your arms because of my invention, and you're asking if anyone else was hurt? Was anyone?" She persisted. "No, no one else was even near the machine." Sarah nodded, satisfied. Then it was an accident. A terrible accident, but not a design flaw that could hurt other people. That's important, Thomas. That machine could still help farmers if you fix whatever went wrong. Dr. Westbrook had seen many patients cope with devastating injuries, but Sarah's reaction was unlike anything in his experience. Most people faced with such catastrophic loss went through predictable stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression. Sarah seemed to be approaching her situation like an engineering problem requiring innovative solutions. "Mrs. Mitchell," the doctor said gently, "I want you to understand that the challenges you'll face, the simple tasks of daily living, will require assistance. Eating, dressing, personal hygiene will require adaptation," Sarah corrected. "Thomas, remember when we were designing the pulley system for the kitchen? You said every mechanical problem has a solution if you approach it correctly." Thomas felt something shift inside him, a spark of the old problem-solving instinct that had driven his inventions. "You're talking about mechanical aids, devices that could ... could replace what I've lost," Sarah finished. "Or at least allow me to function independently." Dr. Westbrook looked skeptical. "Mrs. Mitchell, while I admire your optimism, the idea of mechanical prosthetics that could actually function, the technology simply doesn't exist. Prosthetic limbs are primarily cosmetic. They can't provide real function." But Thomas was already thinking, his engineer's mind beginning to engage with the greatest challenge he had ever faced. As he looked at his wife's determined expression, he realized that this wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of their most important chapter. The weeks that followed tested every aspect of their marriage. Sarah had to learn to accept help with tasks she had performed independently since childhood. Thomas had to learn to be a caregiver while managing the farm alone. Both struggled with guilt, Sarah for being a burden, Thomas for building the machine that had changed their lives. But gradually, as Sarah's physical strength returned and Thomas adapted to his new responsibilities, they began to approach their situation with the same methodical problem-solving that had made their farm successful. Every challenge became a design opportunity. Every limitation became a specification for a device that didn't yet exist. "Show me your hands," Sarah said one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the wheat fields gold. "Show me exactly how you grip things, how you manipulate objects. If I'm going to have mechanical hands, I need to understand how real hands work." And so began the most ambitious project of Thomas Mitchell's life, creating prosthetic arms that could restore his wife's independence. It would require innovations that pushed far beyond existing technology, manufacturing techniques that had never been attempted, and a level of precision that would challenge every skill he possessed. But as Thomas looked at Sarah's determined face in the fading light, he knew that failure was not an option. Love had brought them together, tragedy had tested them, and now innovation would either restore their future or break them completely. The real work was just beginning. Winter arrived early in Nebraska that year, blanketing the Mitchell farm in snow by mid-November and trapping Thomas and Sarah in a cocoon of enforced intimacy that tested every aspect of their relationship. The farmhouse that had once buzzed with the efficiency of two capable partners now moved to the rhythm of one person caring for another, and the adjustment proved more challenging than either had anticipated. Thomas had converted the small parlor into a makeshift workshop, moving his most essential tools from the barn so he could work on prosthetic designs while remaining close enough to help Sarah when needed. The room filled with sketches, mechanical drawings, and failed prototypes, evidence of his growing obsession with solving what he had begun calling the limb problem. Sarah's days followed a routine that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Thomas helped her dress each morning, a process that required him to design special clothing modifications, shirts that opened completely in the front, skirts with drawstring waists that could be adjusted without fine motor control. Meals involved Thomas cutting her food into small pieces and Sarah learning to eat with utensils strapped to her upper arms, a technique Dr. Westbrook had suggested during their final consultation in Omaha. "The key," Sarah said one December morning, as she struggled to manipulate a spoon laden with oatmeal, "is thinking about this mechanically rather than emotionally." Thomas looked up from his latest sketch, a design for a simple gripping mechanism that could be controlled by shoulder movements. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm approaching this like we approached improving the cream separator. We identified what needed to happen separating cream from milk, then designed a mechanism to accomplish that task efficiently." She managed to get the spoon to her mouth without spilling. "My arms need to perform specific functions: grasping, lifting, manipulating objects with precision. The flesh and bone version is gone, so we design a mechanical version." This pragmatic attitude had emerged gradually as Sarah adapted to her new reality. Rather than mourning what she had lost, she focused relentlessly on what needed to be replaced. She had begun keeping detailed notes, dictated to Thomas each evening, about every task that required hand function, cataloging the specific motions and forces involved. "Today I tried to turn the pages of a book," she would say, and Thomas would write, "Page turning requires delicate pinch grip, approximately 2-ounce force, precision control to avoid tearing paper," or "attempted to pick up coffee cup. Need firm grip, approximately 3-pound lifting capacity, heat resistance, ability to release without dropping." These observations formed the basis for Thomas's increasingly sophisticated design work. His first attempts had been crude simple hooks and clamps that could be strapped to Sarah's upper arms. These allowed her to perform basic tasks like opening doors or holding objects, but they lacked the precision and control that would make her truly independent. The breakthrough came in January, during a blizzard that kept them housebound for 3 days. Thomas had been struggling with the problem of creating fingers that could bend and grip with natural motion when Sarah made an observation that changed everything. "Watch how you pick up that pencil," she said as Thomas reached for his drawing tools. "Your thumb doesn't just close against your fingers. It rotates slightly, creating opposition that allows for precision grip." Thomas examined his own hand movements with new attention, suddenly seeing the complex mechanics he had taken for granted his entire life. The human hand wasn't just a grasping device, it was a sophisticated instrument capable of dozens of different grip patterns, each optimized for specific tasks. "Opposition," he murmured, making notes. "The thumb has to be able to oppose the fingers at multiple angles. And the fingers need individual control, not just collective motion." This insight led to his first truly innovative design, a mechanical hand with individually articulated fingers controlled by a system of cables and pulleys. The mechanism was activated by shoulder movements, allowing Sarah to control different grip patterns by shifting her shoulder position in specific ways. Building the prototype took 6 weeks of intensive work. Thomas had to machine each component by hand, creating tiny gears and springs that could provide the delicate control required for finger movement. The harness system that would attach the prosthetic to Sarah's upper arm required multiple fittings and adjustments to achieve both security and comfort. When the first prototype was finally ready for testing, both Sarah and Thomas approached the moment with nervous excitement. The device looked unlike anything either had seen. Part machine, part medical apparatus, with leather straps and metal components that gleamed in the workshop's lamplight. "It's heavier than I expected," Sarah said as Thomas carefully fitted the prosthetic to her right arm. The harness distributed the weight across her shoulder and back, but the mechanical hand itself weighed nearly 4 pounds, substantially more than the flesh and bone hand it replaced. "Weight will be an issue with prolonged use," Thomas acknowledged, making notes for future improvements. "But let's see if the basic functionality works." Sarah experimented with the shoulder movements that controlled the mechanical fingers, learning to isolate the muscle groups that activated different grip patterns. The learning curve was steep. Actions that had been instinctive with her natural hands now required conscious thought and precise muscle control. "Try picking up that wooden block," Thomas suggested, indicating a test object he had prepared. Sarah concentrated, moving her shoulder in the pattern that should activate a basic grip. The mechanical fingers closed around the block with a soft whirring sound, lifted it successfully, then as Sarah tried to adjust her grip, suddenly released it, sending the block clattering to the floor. "The release mechanism is too sensitive," Thomas noted immediately, "and the grip strength needs calibration." "But Sarah, the basic concept works. You just picked up an object using mechanical fingers, controlled by your own muscle movements." Over the following weeks, they refined the design through countless testing sessions. Sarah would attempt increasingly complex tasks, while Thomas observed and modified the mechanism. They discovered that different materials required different grip strengths, that the cable system needed regular maintenance to prevent binding, and that the prosthetic required custom modification for Sarah's specific anatomy and movement patterns. "Today I managed to pick up an egg without breaking it," Sarah announced triumphantly one February afternoon. "And I turned the pages of 3 chapters in my cookbook." These small victories felt enormous in the context of their new life. Each successful task represented not just mechanical achievement, but a step toward the independence that had seemed impossible just months earlier. But the prosthetic hand, remarkable as it was, had limitations that frustrated both inventor and user. The device was exhausting to operate for extended periods, requiring constant conscious control that left Sarah mentally drained. The weight distribution caused shoulder and back pain after prolonged use. Most critically, the prosthetic provided no sensory feedback. Sarah couldn't feel what she was touching, making delicate operations extremely difficult. "I can pick up a teacup," Sarah said during one of their evening evaluation sessions, "but I can't tell if I'm gripping it too tightly until it breaks, or too loosely until it falls." Without feeling, every action is guesswork. Thomas added sensory feedback to his growing list of engineering challenges. How could mechanical fingers convey the sensation of touch? How could artificial limbs communicate texture, temperature, and pressure to the brain? The technical problems were compounded by practical concerns. The prosthetic required daily maintenance, cleaning, oiling, adjustment of cable tensions. The leather components of the harness needed regular conditioning to prevent cracking. Most troubling, the mechanical components showed signs of wear after just 2 months of use, suggesting that durability would be an ongoing issue. "We're making progress," Thomas said one evening as he performed routine maintenance on the prosthetic. But we're also discovering how much we don't know. Creating replacement limbs isn't just about mechanical engineering. It's about understanding human anatomy, muscle physiology, even psychology. Sarah had been researching these broader questions. During her hours of enforced inactivity, using a mouth-held pencil, she had begun corresponding with medical professionals, prosthetists in major cities, and even researchers in Europe who were working on similar problems. Dr. Fulton at Johns Hopkins wrote back, she announced one March morning. He's been developing prosthetics for war veterans and wants to know more about your cable control system. He thinks your approach might be more advanced than anything being done in medical circles. This external validation was encouraging, but it also revealed the isolation of their work. Thomas was essentially inventing an entirely new field of engineering with no textbooks, no established principles, and no community of fellow researchers to consult. Sometimes I feel like we're trying to reinvent the human hand without really understanding how the original works, he confessed during one particularly frustrating day, when multiple design modifications had failed to improve the prosthetics. Performance. Sarah, who had spent the day attempting to knead bread dough with her mechanical hand, an experiment that ended with flour scattered across the kitchen and the prosthetic's grip mechanism jammed with sticky dough, nodded in understanding. Maybe. That's exactly what we need to do, she said. Not just replace what I lost, but understand it so completely that we can improve on it. This conversation marked a shift in their approach. Rather than simply trying to create functional prosthetics, they began studying human hand anatomy with scientific rigor. Thomas obtained medical texts and dissection guides, learning about the complex network of muscles, tendons, and nerves that controlled natural hand movement. Sarah became a test subject for her own body, analyzing how her remaining shoulder and back muscles could be retrained to control artificial limbs. As winter gave way to spring, their workshop had become something between a medical laboratory and an advanced engineering facility. The walls were covered with anatomical charts, mechanical drawings, and photographs documenting their progress. Workbenches held an array of prototypes in various stages of completion, each representing a different approach to the fundamental challenge of replacing human limbs with mechanical alternatives. But their most important discovery was less technical than personal. They had found a shared purpose that transcended the tragedy that had brought them to this point. The accident had taken Sarah's arms, but it had given them both a mission that demanded every skill they possessed and pushed them to develop capabilities they had never known they had. We're not just building prosthetics, Sarah observed one April evening as she successfully used her mechanical hand to thread a needle-lit shoe, task that had seemed impossible just months earlier. We're proving that human beings can adapt to anything if they approach the problem correctly. Thomas nodded, watching his wife's face glow with satisfaction at her achievement. And we're just getting started. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in May, delivered by the postal carrier along with seed catalogs and a medical journal that Sarah had subscribed to from Johns Hopkins. The envelope bore the seal of the United States Patent Office, and Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he opened it while Sarah waited expectantly at the kitchen table. Patent application 1,847,293 has been approved, Thomas read aloud, his voice growing stronger with each word. Mechanical prosthetic hand with cable-actuated articulated digits. Inventor, Thomas Mitchell, Lancaster County, Nebraska. Sarah's face lit up with the first genuinely joyful expression Thomas had seen since the accident. You did it, we did it. The design is officially recognized as an invention. But even as they celebrated this milestone, both understood that a patent was just the beginning. The prosthetic hand that had earned Thomas recognition from the patent office was still too heavy, too difficult to control, and too limited in its capabilities to truly restore Sarah's independence. What they had achieved was proof of concept evidence that mechanical limbs could function. What they needed was a revolution in design and manufacturing. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: their correspondence with Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, a German engineer who had lost his left arm in the war and had been developing prosthetics for wounded veterans in Berlin. Dr. Zimmermann's letter, written in careful English, arrived just days after the patent notification. "Your cable control system is ingenious," he wrote, "but I believe you are approaching the problem from the wrong direction. Instead of trying to replicate human hand mechanics exactly, consider what functions are truly essential and design mechanisms optimized for those specific tasks." The letter included detailed sketches of Zimmermann's own prosthetic designs, which took a radically different approach from Thomas's work. Rather than trying to create artificial fingers that moved like human fingers, Zimmermann had designed interchangeable tools that could be quickly attached to a basic prosthetic arm. Different situations called for different tools: a writing implement for correspondence, a specialized grip for eating, heavy-duty clamps for manual labor. "Modular design," Thomas murmured, studying the German engineer's sketches, "like interchangeable parts in manufacturing. Why didn't I think of this?" Sarah leaned over his shoulder, examining the drawings with intense interest. "Because you were trying to give me back exactly what I lost. But what if what I need isn't identical hands? What if it's better hands? Hands designed specifically for the tasks I need to perform?" This conversation sparked 3 weeks of intensive redesign work. Thomas completely reconceptualized his approach, moving away from biomimetic design toward functional optimization. Instead of one complex prosthetic hand trying to perform all possible tasks, he began developing a system of specialized attachments that could be quickly swapped depending on Sarah's needs. The base unit was elegant in its simplicity: a sturdy, mechanical wrist that could rotate and lock in position, with a quick-release mechanism for changing attachments. The first set of tools included a precision grip for delicate work, a power grip for heavy objects, a writing stylus, and a specialized fork and knife combination for eating. "Try the writing attachment," Thomas suggested after completing the first functional prototype of the modular system. Sarah positioned herself at their kitchen table with a sheet of paper and a bottle of ink. The writing stylus locked into place with a satisfying click, and she began experimenting with the shoulder movements that controlled its position and pressure. "Thomas," she said, her voice filled with wonder, "I just wrote my name. For the first time in 8 months, I wrote my own name." The modular system proved transformative in ways neither had anticipated. Tasks that had been impossible with the single design prosthetic became manageable with the right attachment. Sarah could change from delicate sewing work to heavy kitchen tasks in seconds, simply by swapping tools. But the real breakthrough came when Sarah began suggesting modifications based on her experience using the system. "The writing stylus needs a slight curve," she observed after a day of correspondence work. "And the precision grip should have textured surfaces on the contact points to prevent slipping." These user-driven improvements marked a fundamental shift in their collaboration. Thomas was no longer just building prosthetics for Sarah to use. Sarah was becoming a co-designer, contributing engineering insights based on her unique understanding of what the devices needed to accomplish. "We should document everything," Sarah said one June evening as she successfully prepared an entire meal using various prosthetic attachments. "Other people need this. Other families are dealing with similar situations." This observation led to their decision to establish what they called the Mitchell Institute for Mechanical Rehabilitation. Operating from their farm workshop, they began corresponding with injured individuals across the country, sharing their designs and learning about different adaptation needs. The Institute's first client was James Patterson, a railroad worker from Kansas who had lost his right arm in a coupling accident. Patterson's wife had written to them after reading about Thomas's patent in a railroad worker's newsletter. My husband was a master carpenter before his accident, Mrs. Patterson wrote. Now he sits in his chair all day, convinced he's useless. Could your mechanical hand help him work again? Thomas and Sarah spent 2 weeks designing specialized woodworking attachments for their modular system, a holding clamp that could secure lumber while Patterson worked with his remaining hand, a specialized chisel guide for precision carving, and a sanding attachment that distributed pressure evenly across wooden surfaces. When the completed prosthetic system arrived in Kansas, Patterson's response exceeded their most optimistic expectations. For the first time since my accident, I built something today, he wrote. A simple birdhouse. But I built it myself. My wife cried watching me work. Thank you for giving me back my purpose. Word of their success began spreading through networks of injured workers, veterans, and medical professionals. Letters arrived from across the country, farmers who had lost limbs to machinery, soldiers returning from overseas conflicts, industrial workers injured in factory accidents. Each case presented unique challenges that pushed Thomas and Sarah to develop new solutions. Dr. Margaret Thornton, one of the few female physicians in the country, traveled from Chicago specifically to observe their work. A specialist in rehabilitation medicine, Dr. Thornton was researching innovative approaches to helping patients adapt to permanent disabilities. What you've accomplished here is remarkable, she told them after spending 3 days observing Sarah's use of the prosthetic system. But I think you're underestimating the broader implications of your work. Dr. Thornton had connections at major medical schools and research hospitals. She had seen the most advanced prosthetic devices available in 1924, and she insisted that the Mitchell system was years ahead of anything being developed in formal medical research. You need to present your work at the National Medical Conference in Boston this fall, she urged. The medical community needs to understand what's possible with proper engineering approach to prosthetics. The idea of presenting their work to medical professionals was both exciting and terrifying. Thomas had never spoken publicly about his inventions, and Sarah had never imagined herself as a research subject whose experiences could influence medical practice. But as summer progressed and more success stories arrived from people using their prosthetic designs, they began to understand that their work had implications far beyond their personal situation. We're not just solving our own problem anymore, Sarah observed one August evening as she sorted through correspondence from prosthetic users across the country. We're proving that independence is possible even after devastating injury. The decision to attend the Boston conference required months of preparation. Thomas had to create presentation materials explaining his engineering approaches, while Sarah worked on documenting the user experience and adaptation process. Together, they developed a comprehensive case study that combined technical innovation with practical application. But the conference would also force them to confront a fundamental question about their future. Were they farmers who had developed innovative prosthetics, or were they researchers whose work could transform rehabilitation medicine? If we go to Boston, Thomas said one evening as they discussed the presentation requirements, everything changes. We won't just be Thomas and Sarah Mitchell working in a farm workshop anymore. We'll be public figures representing a new approach to prosthetics. Sarah tested her latest prosthetic attachment, a delicate tool designed for flower arranging that demonstrated the system's precision capabilities. Maybe that's exactly what we need to become, she replied. Maybe our accident wasn't just something that happened to us. Maybe it was something that happened for a purpose. As autumn approached and their departure for Boston grew near, both Sarah and Thomas felt the weight of representing not just their own innovations, but the hopes of injured people across the country who were looking for proof that their lives could still have meaning and purpose. The farm that had once represented the simple life they had planned together was now the headquarters of a movement that could change how society viewed disability and human potential. Their personal tragedy had become the foundation for discoveries that could transform thousands of lives. In just 18 months, they had progressed from a farming couple dealing with a devastating accident to pioneers in a field that didn't previously exist. But their greatest challenges and their most important discoveries still lay ahead. The grand ballroom of the Boston Medical Society resembled a cathedral of scientific authority, its soaring ceilings and mahogany-paneled walls having witnessed decades of medical breakthroughs and professional debates. As Thomas and Sarah entered the imposing space on that crisp October morning in 1924, they found themselves facing an audience of nearly 300 physicians, surgeons, and medical researchers, the most distinguished gathering of medical professionals in the country. Sarah wore a specially designed dress that concealed her prosthetic attachments while allowing full demonstration of their capabilities. Thomas carried a leather case containing their most advanced prosthetic components and a presentation folder thick with technical drawings, user testimonials, and photographic documentation of their work. Dr. Edmund Whitmore, the conference chairman and chief of surgery at Massachusetts General Hospital, introduced them with the kind of polite skepticism that suggested he expected their presentation to be an interesting curiosity rather than a serious contribution to medical science. Ladies and gentlemen, we have with us today Mr. Thomas Mitchell, a mechanical engineer from Nebraska, and his wife Sarah, who will be demonstrating some innovative approaches to prosthetic limb replacement. While their work falls outside traditional medical research, Dr. Thornton has suggested it merits our attention. The subtle dismissal in Dr. Whitmore's tone was unmistakable. Thomas felt his confidence waver as he surveyed the sea of skeptical faces, many belonging to men who had trained at the most prestigious medical schools in the world. What right did a farm engineer have to address such an assembly? But Sarah, positioned at the demonstration table they had requested, seemed unaffected by the intimidating atmosphere. She began by removing her dress jacket, revealing the sleek harness system that connected her prosthetic arms to her shoulders and back. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast room, 18 months ago, I lost both arms in a farm accident. Today, I'm going to show you what my husband and I have learned about replacing human limbs with mechanical alternatives." The transformation in the room was immediate. The casual conversations that had continued during Dr. Whitmore's introduction ceased abruptly. Every physician present had dealt with amputation cases, and most had watched patients struggle with the crude prosthetics available through traditional medical channels. Sarah began with simple demonstrations, picking up a glass of water, writing her name with flowing script, threading a needle with steady precision. But as she progressed to more complex tasks, the audience's attention sharpened into intense focus. "The key insight," Thomas explained as Sarah demonstrated the quick-release mechanism that allowed her to change attachments, "is that human hands perform dozens of different functions, each requiring specialized grip patterns and force applications. Rather than trying to create one prosthetic that does everything poorly, we've developed a modular system where each attachment is optimized for specific tasks." Dr. Harold Brennan, a prominent surgeon from Johns Hopkins, leaned forward in his seat. "Mrs. Mitchell, what's the maximum weight you can lift with those devices?" Sarah smiled, attaching a specialized lifting clamp to her right prosthetic. She lifted a 20-pound medical textbook from the demonstration table with ease, held it steady for several seconds, then set it down with precise control. 20 pounds is comfortable for extended periods," she replied. "We've tested up to 40 pounds for brief lifting tasks, but that exceeds the comfortable limits of the shoulder harness system." The questions came rapidly after that. Dr. Robert Kellerman from Harvard wanted to know about the cable control mechanism. Dr. Martha Osborne, one of only 3 female physicians in the audience, asked about the psychological adaptation process. Dr. William Nash from the Veterans Administration was intensely interested in the potential applications for war injuries, but it was Dr. Francis Blackwood from the University of Chicago, who asked the question that would change everything. Mr. Mitchell, have you considered the commercial potential of this technology? The number of people who could benefit from these devices? Thomas had prepared for technical questions, medical inquiries, and even professional skepticism. He hadn't expected to discuss business applications with medical professionals. Our focus has been on helping individuals adapt to limb loss, he replied carefully. We've worked with about 30 people so far, creating custom prosthetic systems. For their specific needs, Dr. Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. 30 individuals. But consider the broader population. Industrial accidents, war injuries, congenital conditions. We're talking about potentially thousands of people who could benefit from your innovations. Sarah, who had been listening while cleaning her prosthetic attachments, looked up sharply. Are you suggesting we should be manufacturing these devices commercially? I'm suggesting, Dr. Blackwood said, that keeping revolutionary medical technology limited to custom fabrication in a farm workshop may not serve the broader public interest. The comments sparked a heated discussion among the assembled physicians. Some argued that prosthetics were inherently medical devices requiring individual customization under physician supervision. Others insisted that Thomas's engineering approach could be scaled up for mass production while maintaining effectiveness. Dr. Whitmore, who had begun the session with polite skepticism, found himself moderating an increasingly passionate debate about the future of rehabilitation medicine. Order, please, he called as voices rose throughout the ballroom. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, this discussion raises important questions about the relationship between medical practice and mechanical engineering. Have you considered working with established medical device manufacturers? Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances. They had been so focused on perfecting their designs and helping individual users that they hadn't seriously considered the industrial implications of their work. We've had some preliminary discussions with manufacturing companies, Thomas said, which was technically true. They had received 3 letters from companies interested in licensing their patents. But our priority has been ensuring that the technology actually works for the people who need it. Dr. Eleanor Prescott, a rehabilitation specialist from Philadelphia, stood up. I'd like to address a concern that I think many of us share. Mr. Mitchell, your engineering background is impressive, but prosthetic fitting requires understanding of human anatomy, muscle physiology, and psychological adaptation. How do you ensure that your devices don't cause secondary injuries or adaptation problems? The question was politely phrased, but its implication was clear. Thomas wasn't a medical professional, and his prosthetics might be causing harm that he wasn't qualified to recognize. Sarah responded before Thomas could answer. Dr. Prescott, I've been using these prosthetics for over a year. I can tell you exactly how they affect my posture, muscle development, and psychological well-being. I've also corresponded with 32 other users who provide regular feedback on their experiences. She paused, letting her words sink in. The difference between our approach and traditional medical prosthetics is that we're not just fitting devices to patients, we're creating tools that restore function. The medical professionals I've worked with have been amazed by what I can accomplish. Dr. Prescott looked somewhat taken aback. I didn't mean to suggest that your personal experience isn't valuable. But individual cases, even 32 of them, don't constitute clinical evidence. Then let's create clinical evidence, Sarah said firmly. Establish a formal study. Test our prosthetics against traditional devices. Measure functional outcomes, user satisfaction, and adaptation success rates. We're confident in our results. The boldness of her challenge electrified the room. Dr. Whitmore looked around the ballroom, noting the intense interest on his colleagues. Faces, Mrs. Mitchell. Are you proposing a formal clinical trial comparing your prosthetic system to current medical devices? I'm proposing that we move beyond theoretical discussions and test what actually works, Sarah replied. Science should be based on evidence, not assumptions about what's possible. Dr. Thornton, who had been quiet throughout most of the presentation, finally spoke up. "I've observed Mrs. Mitchell's prosthetic use extensively. Her functional capabilities exceed anything I've seen in traditional rehabilitation settings. The question isn't whether this technology works, it's whether the medical community is ready to embrace innovations that come from outside traditional research channels." The comment exposed the underlying tension in the room. Many of the physicians present had spent decades working within established medical hierarchies, where innovations typically emerged from university research labs and hospital settings. The idea that a farm engineer and his wife could revolutionize prosthetics challenged fundamental assumptions about medical expertise. Dr. Benjamin Foster from the Mayo Clinic stood up. "I move that we establish a formal committee to evaluate the Mitchell prosthetic system. If their claims are substantiated, we have an obligation to ensure this technology reaches the patients who need it." The motion sparked immediate debate. Some physicians worried about endorsing technology developed outside medical supervision. Others argued that the medical community had a responsibility to investigate any innovation that might help patients. After 20 minutes of increasingly heated discussion, Dr. Whitmore called for a vote. The result was decisive. 47 physicians voted to establish the evaluation committee, with only 12 opposed. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell," Dr. Whitmore announced, "the Boston Medical Society will establish a formal committee to evaluate your prosthetic technology. We'll arrange for clinical trials at multiple medical centers, with standardized testing protocols and independent assessment of outcomes." As the session concluded and physicians began approaching them with individual questions and comments, Thomas felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. In 2 hours, their personal solution to Sarah's injury had become the subject of formal medical investigation. "We came here to share our work with doctors," he said to Sarah as they packed their demonstration materials. "We're leaving with a commitment to prove that our approach can change rehabilitation medicine." Sarah smiled, efficiently storing her prosthetic attachments in their custom carrying case. "Thomas, did you notice what just happened? For the first time since my accident, I wasn't introduced as the patient or the victim. I was treated as a researcher presenting scientific findings." The observation struck Thomas powerfully. Sarah had indeed transformed from a woman who had lost her arms to a woman who had gained expertise that medical professionals respected. Her disability had become her qualification, but as they prepared to leave Boston and return to their Nebraska farm, both understood that their lives had changed irrevocably. They were no longer just Thomas and Sarah Mitchell, working in isolation to solve their personal challenges. They were now pioneers in a field that could transform how society viewed disability and human potential. The medical committee's investigation would either validate their work and launch them into national prominence, or expose fundamental flaws that would end their influence before it truly began. Either way, there was no going back to the simple life they had once planned together. As their train pulled away from Boston's South Station, Sarah watched the city disappear while flexing her prosthetic fingers with unconscious precision. In 6 months, they would know whether their farm workshop innovations could withstand the scrutiny of the medical establishment. The stakes had never been higher, but neither had the potential to help thousands of people who, like Sarah, refused to accept that injury meant the end of independence and purpose. The telegram arrived on a snow-covered February morning in 1925, delivered by young Billy Harrison, who had ridden his bicycle through knee-deep drifts to bring news that would determine the fate of everything Thomas and Sarah had built over the past year and a half. Clinical trials approved. Stop Chicago Veterans Hospital, March 15th. Stop 12 subjects selected. Stop prepare for intensive evaluation. Stop Dr. Blackwood. Sarah read the message twice, her prosthetic fingers gripping the yellow paper with steady precision. 4 months had passed since their Boston presentation. 4 months of waiting while the medical committee debated protocols, selected test sites, and identified suitable subjects for comparison studies. 12 subjects, Thomas said, looking up from the workbench where he'd been crafting a new set of prosthetic attachments. That means we need to produce 12 complete prosthetic systems in less than 4 weeks. The magnitude of the task was staggering. Each prosthetic system required individual fitting, customization, and extensive testing before it could be considered ready for clinical evaluation. Their farm workshop, equipped for producing 1 or 2 devices at a time, would need to become a manufacturing facility overnight. But even more challenging than the production requirements was the emotional weight of what they were about to undertake. 12 people, veterans who had lost limbs in the war, industrial workers injured in accidents, individuals whose lives had been shattered by circumstances beyond their control, were about to place their hopes for restored independence in devices created by a farm engineer and his wife. What if we're wrong? Sarah asked one evening as they worked late into the night, Thomas machining components while Sarah assembled harness systems. What if our prosthetics work for me because I helped design them, but fail for other people? Thomas paused in his work, considering the question that had haunted both of them since accepting the clinical trial challenge. Then we'll learn from the failures and design better devices. But Sarah, we've already helped 32 people regain functions they thought they'd lost forever. This technology works. The journey to Chicago in mid-March felt like a pilgrimage to judgment. Their train car had been modified to accommodate 12 carefully packed prosthetic systems, each one representing weeks of intensive labor. Sarah had created detailed instruction manuals for each device, while Thomas had prepared training materials for the medical professionals who would supervise the trials. Dr. Francis Blackwood met them at Union Station, his expression revealing the pressure he felt as the physician who had championed their technology to his colleagues. The Chicago Veterans Hospital had agreed to host the trials, but skepticism remained high among the medical staff. "I want you to understand what we're facing," Dr. Blackwood said as they rode toward the hospital in his automobile. "Half the physicians here believe your prosthetics are clever gadgets that will prove impractical for real-world use. The other half worry that untrained engineers are practicing medicine without proper qualifications." Sarah, seated in the back of the car with her prosthetic demonstration kit, nodded grimly. "What do you believe, Dr. Blackwood?" "I believe that medicine advances when we test new ideas rigorously, regardless of their source," he replied. "But I also believe that if your devices fail these trials, it will be years before the medical community considers another engineering-based approach to prosthetics." The Chicago Veterans Hospital was a sprawling complex of brick buildings that housed hundreds of men whose bodies bore the permanent scars of warfare. As Thomas and Sarah walked through the corridors toward the prosthetics department, they passed wheelchairs, crutches, and faces marked by resignation to permanent disability. "These are the men who will test your devices," Dr. Blackwood explained, as they entered a large room where 12 individuals waited. All have lost one or both arms. All have tried traditional prosthetics with limited success. All have volunteered to participate in these trials. The introductions were sobering. Robert Chun, a former artillery officer who had lost his right arm to shrapnel at Below Wood. Michael O'Brien, a factory worker whose left arm had been crushed in a press accident. William Jackson, a farmer from Iowa whose threshing machine accident had cost him both arms, a mirror of Sarah's own experience. "Before we begin," Dr. Blackwood announced, "I want to establish the testing protocol. Each subject will spend 2 weeks learning to use the Mitchell prosthetic system. They'll be evaluated on their ability to perform standardized tasks compared to their current prosthetic devices, and assessed for comfort, functionality, and psychological adaptation." The first week proved more challenging than anyone had anticipated. The subjects struggled with the shoulder control system that seemed natural to Sarah, but required completely different muscle memory for new users. Several complained about the weight of the devices. which felt cumbersome compared to their simple hook and cable prosthetics. "I can't get the grip pressure right," complained Frank Morrison, a former machinist who had lost his left arm in a lathe accident. "Either I'm crushing things or they're slipping out of my grip." Thomas worked with each subject individually, adjusting cable tensions and modifying harness fits. Sarah demonstrated techniques she had developed for controlling the prosthetics, but it became clear that her year of experience gave her capabilities that couldn't be quickly replicated. Dr. Helen Kruger, the hospital's chief rehabilitation specialist, observed the training sessions with obvious skepticism. "Mrs. Mitchell, your proficiency with these devices is impressive, but you've been using them for over a year. These men are trying to learn complex motor skills in a matter of days." The criticism was fair but discouraging. By the end of the first week, only 4 of the 12 subjects had achieved basic competency with the prosthetic systems. The others struggled with coordination, complained about discomfort, or simply couldn't adapt to the radically different control requirements. "This isn't working," Thomas confided to Sarah as they reviewed the week's disappointing results. "Maybe the medical professionals are right. Maybe our prosthetics are too complex for practical use." But Sarah had been observing the training sessions with the analytical mind that had helped her master the prosthetics herself. "The problem isn't the prosthetics," she said. "It's the training approach. We're trying to teach these men to use mechanical devices the same way we'd teach them to use traditional prosthetics. But our system requires completely different thinking." That insight led to a radical change in their approach. Instead of focusing on mechanical operation, Sarah began teaching the subjects to think like engineers, to understand what the prosthetics were designed to accomplish and how to optimize their use for specific tasks. "Don't try to make the prosthetic handwork like your natural hand," she explained to William Jackson during an individual session. "Think of it as a specialized tool that you control with precision. Each attachment is designed for specific functions. Master one function at a time." The breakthrough came during the second week when Michael O'Brien successfully assembled a complex mechanical device using his prosthetic system. The task required precise coordination between multiple attachments, delicate pressure control, and sustained concentration, exactly the kind of activity that traditional prosthetics couldn't support. "I built this," O'Brien announced, holding up the completed assembly with obvious pride. "For the first time since my accident, I built something with my own hands." Word of O'Brien's success spread quickly through the hospital. Other subjects began approaching their training with renewed determination, and by the end of the second week, 9 of the 12 had achieved functional competency with the prosthetic systems. The formal evaluation session took place in the hospital's main auditorium, with 20 physicians observing as each subject demonstrated their capabilities. The standardized tests included writing, eating, manipulating small objects, and lifting various weights activities that represented fundamental requirements for independent living. Robert Chun wrote his name in clear, legible script using the prosthetic writing attachment. Frank Morrison assembled and disassembled a complex mechanical device with precision that impressed the observing physicians. William Jackson prepared and ate a complete meal using specialized eating utensils. But the most powerful moment came when Dr. Kruger asked the subjects to compare their experience with the Mitchell prosthetics to their previous devices. "My old prosthetic hook could grab things and hold them," said Michael O'Brien. "But these devices let me work. They give me back my trade, my purpose. I can be a productive man again instead of just a disabled veteran." The sentiment was echoed by subject after subject. While the Mitchell prosthetics required more training and adjustment than traditional devices, they offered capabilities that transformed users' lives in ways that simple hook and cable systems never could. Dr. Blackwood summarized the trial results. "With scientific precision, functional capability assessment shows 300% improvement over standard prosthetics. User satisfaction ratings exceed 90%. Psychological adaptation indicators suggest significant improvements in self-efficacy and life satisfaction. But even more significant than the statistical measures were the personal transformations visible in the trial subjects. Men who had entered the study resigned to permanent disability were making plans to return to work, to rebuild their lives, to reclaim their independence. Dr. Kruger, who had begun the trials as a skeptic, found herself reconsidering fundamental assumptions about prosthetic rehabilitation. "I've been fitting prosthetics for 15 years, she admitted to Sarah during the final evaluation session. "I've never seen devices that restore this level of functional capability." As the trials concluded and the subjects prepared to return to their lives now equipped with prosthetic systems that would allow them to work, create, and live independently, Thomas and Sarah felt the weight of what they had accomplished. "We didn't just prove that our prosthetics work," Sarah observed as they packed their equipment for the journey home. "We proved that people can adapt to technologies that restore their capabilities rather than just compensating for their limitations." The clinical trial results would be published in medical journals, presented at conferences, and used to establish new standards for prosthetic rehabilitation. But for Thomas and Sarah, the real victory was simpler. 12 people who had lost hope along with their limbs were leaving Chicago with both restored. The telegram from Dr. Blackwood arrived 3 days after their return to Nebraska. "Trial successful. Stop Medical Committee recommends full endorsement. Stop prepare. For national recognition. Stop congratulations." But recognition, they would soon discover, brought its own challenges and opportunities that would test everything. They had learned about innovation, partnership, and the power of human determination to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The sound of construction hammers echoed across the Mitchell farm as crews worked to transform their barn into something Nebraska had never seen before, a precision manufacturing facility dedicated to producing prosthetic devices. It was June 1925, and Thomas stood in the doorway of what would become America's first specialized prosthetics factory, watching workmen install industrial machinery that would allow them to meet the overwhelming demand generated by their successful clinical trials. The letters had begun arriving within days of the medical committee's endorsement. Physicians from across the country requested prosthetic systems for their patients. Veterans organizations inquired about bulk orders. Industrial companies wanted to provide prosthetics for workers injured in on-the-job accidents. The Mitchell Institute for Mechanical Rehabilitation, which had operated from a farm workshop with a single skilled craftsman, suddenly faced orders for hundreds of prosthetic systems. "We've received 43 new requests this week alone," Sarah announced, sorting through the morning mail with efficient movements of her prosthetic attachments. "Dr. Patterson in Philadelphia wants 15 systems for his rehabilitation clinic. The Veterans Administration in Washington is asking about a contract for 200 units. Thomas reviewed the production calculations he had been working on. "For weeks, even with the new machinery, we can only manufacture about 20 systems per month. At that rate, we'll have a 2-year backlog before we even consider new orders." The mathematics of scaling their operation were daunting. Each prosthetic system required precision machining of dozens of components, custom fitting for individual users, and extensive testing before delivery. The artisanal approach that had worked for their initial clients was completely inadequate for meeting national demand. But the real challenge wasn't just production, it was maintaining quality while increasing quantity. Thomas had built every prosthetic system personally, ensuring that each component met his exacting standards. How could they preserve that level of precision while training other craftsmen to manufacture devices they had never seen before? "We need to hire skilled machinists," Thomas said, studying the factory floor plan they had developed. "But more than that, we need to systematize our manufacturing process. Everything that I do by experience and intuition needs to be documented, measured, and teachable." Sarah had been thinking along similar lines. We also need to train fitting specialists. I can't personally fit every prosthetic system we manufacture. Other people need to learn how to customize the devices for individual users. The solution they developed was revolutionary in its own right: the first comprehensive training program for prosthetic manufacturing and fitting. Thomas created detailed technical manuals documenting every aspect of construction, from metallurgy specifications to assembly procedures. Sarah developed protocols for measuring patients, adjusting fit, and training users to operate their prosthetic systems effectively. Their first employee was Marcus Weber, a German immigrant who had worked as a precision instrument maker before the war. Weber possessed the mechanical skills necessary for prosthetic manufacturing, but he had no experience with medical devices or human anatomy. The tolerance for error is much smaller than clockwork, Thomas explained as he trained Weber on the machining requirements. A clock that's slightly imprecise still tells time. A prosthetic that's slightly imprecise causes pain and dysfunction. Weber proved to be an exceptional student, quickly mastering the precision requirements and contributing improvements to the manufacturing process. His suggestion for a specialized jig that held prosthetic components during machining improved both accuracy and production speed. The second hire was even more significant. Dr. Anna Hoffman, a young physician who had specialized in rehabilitation medicine at Johns Hopkins. Dr. Hoffman had read about the Mitchell prosthetics in medical journals and had written requesting an opportunity to learn their fitting and training methods. "I want to understand how engineering principles can be applied to medical practice," she explained during her interview. "Traditional prosthetics focus on cosmetic appearance and basic function. Your approach seems to prioritize restoration of capability." Dr. Hoffman's medical background provided crucial credibility for their expanding operation. Physicians who might have been skeptical of prosthetics fitted by a farmer's wife were willing to trust devices prescribed and fitted by a Johns Hopkins-trained doctor, but Sarah was initially resistant to sharing her role as primary fitting specialist. "I've developed these techniques through experience," she told Thomas. "How can I teach someone else to do what I learned through trial and error?" The solution emerged through necessity when a rush order arrived from a Veterans Administration hospital in Texas. 12 former soldiers needed prosthetic systems, but the hospital couldn't send them to Nebraska for individual fitting. Sarah would have to train Dr. Hoffman to provide fitting services remotely. "Start with measurements," Sarah instructed, demonstrating her techniques on a practice subject. "But remember, every measurement relates to function. We're not just determining size, we're identifying how the prosthetic will integrate with the user's existing muscle structure and movement patterns." Dr. Hoffman proved to be a remarkably quick learner, grasping not just the technical aspects of fitting, but the psychological elements that made Sarah's approach so successful. She understood that prosthetic fitting was as much about rebuilding confidence as it was about restoring function. The manufacturing challenge intensified in August when they received an unexpected visitor: Harrison Blackstone, president of Blackstone Medical Manufacturing, one of the largest medical device companies in America. Blackstone had traveled from Philadelphia specifically to evaluate the Mitchell prosthetics operation. "Your clinical trial results have created quite a stir in medical device circles," Blackstone explained as Thomas and Sarah gave him a tour of their expanded facility. "My company is interested in licensing your technology for mass production." The proposal was both flattering and alarming. Blackstone Medical could manufacture thousands of prosthetic systems annually, reaching patients across the country and around the world. But mass production would inevitably mean compromises in quality and customization. "How would you maintain the precision necessary for proper function?" Thomas asked. "These devices require individual customization for each user." Blackstone waved dismissively. "We'd standardize the designs, create size categories like clothing. Maybe 4 or 5 standard configurations that would fit most patients. The cost savings would make prosthetics available to people who can't afford custom devices. Sarah's response was immediate and firm. Mr. Blackstone, standardized prosthetics, would provide standardized limitations. Every person's amputation is unique. Their remaining muscle structure is unique. Their functional requirements are unique. Mass production would mean mass mediocrity. The conversation revealed fundamental philosophical differences about prosthetic rehabilitation. Blackstone viewed prosthetics as medical devices to be manufactured efficiently and sold profitably. The Mitchells viewed them as tools for restoring human potential, requiring individual attention and customization. "You're thinking too small," Blackstone insisted. "Your current operation might help hundreds of people. My company could help tens of thousands." Thomas considered the argument carefully. What if we could do both? What if we developed manufacturing techniques that allowed mass production while maintaining individual customization? The idea that emerged from this discussion would revolutionize not just prosthetics manufacturing, but medical device production generally. Modular manufacturing with customizable components. Instead of building each prosthetic system from scratch, they would manufacture standardized base units that could be customized with interchangeable components for individual users. "We create a library of modular parts," Thomas explained to his growing team of engineers and machinists. "Standard wrist units, shoulder harnesses, and control systems. But the attachments, the fitting components, the adjustment mechanisms, those are customized for each individual." The modular approach allowed them to increase production while maintaining the customization that made their prosthetics effective. Standard components could be manufactured in quantity, reducing costs and delivery times. Custom components could be produced quickly using the standardized base systems. Dr. Hoffman contributed medical expertise to the modular design process, helping identify which components required customization and which could be standardized without affecting function. Her input proved crucial in developing sizing protocols that maintained fit precision while allowing for mass production. By September 1925, the Mitchell Prosthetics Company was producing 40 systems per month, with orders booked months in advance. Their factory employed 12 skilled workers, including machinists, assemblers, and fitting specialists. Dr. Hoffman had established a training program that was preparing prosthetic specialists for deployment across the country, but success brought new challenges. Competitors emerged, offering cheaper prosthetics that copied surface features of the Mitchell designs without understanding the engineering principles that made them effective. Patent disputes arose as other inventors claimed credit for innovations they had developed independently. Most significantly, the medical establishment began to push back against the idea of engineers and farmers determining medical treatment protocols. The American Medical Association issued a statement questioning whether prosthetic devices should be manufactured by non-medical personnel. "They're trying to protect their territory," Sarah observed as she read the AMA statement. "They're worried that our success proves that medical innovation can come from outside traditional medical institutions." Thomas felt the weight of institutional opposition. "Maybe we should have partnered with a medical school or hospital from the beginning. Maybe we should have worked within the system instead of challenging it." But their users provided the strongest argument for their approach. Letters arrived daily from prosthetic recipients, describing restored capabilities and rebuilt lives. Frank Morrison had returned to work as a machinist. William Jackson was successfully farming again. Michael O'Brien had started his own small manufacturing business. "The prosthetics don't just work," Sarah said, reading through user testimonials. "They're allowing people to exceed their pre-injury capabilities in some areas." The precision and strength of mechanical systems, combined with human intelligence and creativity, create possibilities that natural limbs couldn't achieve. As winter approached, Thomas and Sarah faced a crucial decision about their future. They could continue expanding their own manufacturing operation, potentially growing into a national medical device company. They could license their technology to established manufacturers, ensuring widespread availability but losing control over quality and innovation. Or they could remain a specialized operation, focusing on the most challenging cases and continuing to push the boundaries of what prosthetics could achieve. What matters most? Sarah asked during one of their evening planning sessions. Helping as many people as possible, or helping people achieve the highest possible level of function? Thomas considered the question that would determine not just their business strategy but their legacy. Maybe we don't have to choose. Maybe we can find a way to do both. The answer would come from an unexpected source, and it would transform their understanding of what they had really accomplished through their journey from farm accident to medical revolution. The letter that would change everything arrived on a December morning in 1925, bearing the official seal of the United States War Department. Thomas opened it with trembling hands, while Sarah watched from across their kitchen table, her prosthetic fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had grown cold as they waited for news that could determine the future of everything they had built. The Secretary of War requests a meeting regarding prosthetic services for disabled veterans. Thomas read aloud, his voice growing stronger with each word. The department wishes to discuss a comprehensive contract for prosthetic rehabilitation services. Meeting scheduled for January 15, 1926, Washington, D.C. Sarah set down her coffee cup with a precise motion that had become second nature. The War Department. Thomas, they're talking about every wounded veteran in America. That's thousands of people. The implications were staggering. The War Department contract would dwarf every order they had received combined, potentially requiring them to expand their operation beyond anything they had imagined possible. But it would also represent federal government endorsement of their approach to prosthetic rehabilitation, validation that could silence their critics and establish their methods as the new standard of care. The journey to Washington in January took them through a winter landscape transformed by industrial progress. From their train window, they watched smoke-belching factories and growing cities that represented America's rapid transformation from an agricultural to an industrial society. The same mechanical innovations that had claimed Sarah's arms were reshaping the entire nation. "Look at all those factories," Sarah observed as they passed through Pittsburgh's Steel District. "Every one of them employs workers who face the same risks we faced on our farm. Industrial accidents are becoming more common, not less." Thomas nodded grimly, "which means the need for effective prosthetics will only grow. We're not just solving yesterday's problems, we're preparing for tomorrow's." The War Department meeting took place in an imposing conference room, dominated by a massive oak table and portraits of military leaders stretching back to the Revolutionary War. General Henry Morrison, the department's chief medical officer, presided over an assembly of military physicians, procurement officials, and rehabilitation specialists. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell," General Morrison began, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "The department has reviewed your clinical trial results and manufacturing capabilities. We're impressed by your success rates and user satisfaction scores." Colonel James Whitaker, the department's chief of prosthetic services, consulted a thick folder of documents. "Our current prosthetic contractors provide basic hook and cable systems that, frankly, barely qualify as functional devices. Veterans receive them, use them briefly, then abandon them as more hindrance than help." Sarah leaned forward, her prosthetic hands folded professionally on the table. "Colonel Whitaker, what specific functional requirements do your veterans need most?" "Independence," Whitaker replied immediately. "The ability to work, to support their families, to contribute to society instead of being dependent on government assistance. Our current prosthetics don't provide that." Thomas spread out technical drawings of their modular prosthetic system. Our approach focuses on restoring capability rather than just replacing limbs. Veterans aren't just missing arms, they're missing the ability to perform skilled work, to create, to live independently. Dr. Margaret Stevenson, the department's chief rehabilitation specialist, examined the drawings with obvious interest. Your modular system allows for different attachments for different tasks. Could a veteran have multiple specialized tools for different work requirements? Not just different tools, Sarah explained, but tools optimized for their specific employment goals. A veteran planning to return to carpentry work would receive attachments designed for precision woodworking. Someone interested in farming would get heavy-duty implements for agricultural tasks. General Morrison's expression grew more interested. You're talking about vocational-specific prosthetics. Devices that don't just compensate for disability, but actually enhance capability for particular trades. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of viewing prosthetics as medical devices that help disabled people cope with their limitations, the War Department was considering them as vocational tools that could help veterans excel in chosen careers. We've already seen this with our civilian clients, Thomas said. Frank Morrison, who lost his arm in a factory accident, now performs precision machining work that exceeds what most workers with natural hands can achieve. The mechanical precision of prosthetic attachments, combined with human intelligence and experience, creates capabilities that surpass normal human limitations. Colonel Whitaker leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. You're suggesting that veterans with prosthetics could become more skilled workers than they were before their injuries? In specific areas, yes, Sarah replied. A prosthetic hand doesn't get tired, doesn't shake, doesn't lose grip strength. Combined with proper training and specialized attachments, veterans could become master craftsmen in their chosen fields. Dr. Stevenson had been taking notes throughout the discussion. This approaches disability from a completely different angle. Instead of focusing on what veterans have lost, you're focusing on what they can gain. The philosophical shift was profound. Traditional rehabilitation aimed to help disabled individuals adapt to their limitations. The Mitchell approach aimed to help them transcend those limitations through technological enhancement. General Morrison stood up, walking to the room's large windows that overlooked the Potomac River. The department faces a choice. We can continue providing basic prosthetics that barely work, or we can embrace an approach that might actually restore veterans to productive lives. There's a third option, Thomas said quietly. We can establish a new model for prosthetic rehabilitation that serves not just veterans but all Americans who face limb loss. The War Department could lead a transformation in how society views disability and human potential. The general turned back to the table. Explain. Sarah took over the explanation. Create a comprehensive prosthetic rehabilitation program that includes not just device manufacturing, but training, vocational preparation, and job placement. Veterans don't just need prosthetics. They need pathways to meaningful careers that utilize their enhanced capabilities. Colonel Whitaker was already thinking through the implementation challenges. We'd need training facilities, skilled instructors, partnerships with employers willing to hire veterans with prosthetics. We'd need to change how society thinks about disability, Dr. Stevenson added. Most employers see prosthetics as evidence of limitation. They need to understand that modern prosthetics can represent enhanced capability. Thomas spread out additional documents letters from employers who had hired their prosthetic users, productivity reports showing exceptional performance, photographs of veterans working in skilled trades with obvious competence and pride. The evidence is already there, he said. Veterans with properly fitted prosthetics consistently outperform their colleagues in precision tasks, endurance work, and complex assembly operations. The challenge isn't proving capability, it's changing perceptions. General Morrison returned to his seat, his expression reflecting the weight of the decision he faced. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, The department is prepared to offer you a comprehensive contract for prosthetic services. But we're also considering something more ambitious, a partnership to establish a new model for veteran rehabilitation that other countries might emulate. The proposal that emerged over the following hours was unprecedented in scope and vision. The War Department would provide funding for a dramatic expansion of the Mitchell Prosthetics Company, including construction of a major manufacturing facility, establishment of regional training centers, and development of a comprehensive vocational rehabilitation program. In return, the Mitchells would develop prosthetic systems specifically designed for various trades and professions, train a corps of fitting specialists and rehabilitation counselors, and create employment partnerships with companies willing to hire veterans with enhanced prosthetic capabilities. This goes far beyond prosthetics, Sarah realized as they reviewed the contract terms. We're talking about creating a new pathway from military service to civilian careers that doesn't exist now. Dr. Stevenson nodded enthusiastically. Veterans with prosthetics would become skilled specialists in high-demand trades. Instead of being burdened on government support, they'd become economic contributors with unique capabilities. But the proposal also included requirements that would test the Mitchells' commitment to their principles. The War Department wanted standardized prosthetic systems that could be mass-produced efficiently, potentially compromising the individual customization that made their devices so effective. "We can't sacrifice quality for quantity," Thomas said firmly. Standardized prosthetics would mean standardized limitations. Veterans deserve better than one-size-fits-all solutions. General Morrison leaned forward. "Then help us figure out how to provide individual customization at scale. The department serves over 30,000 disabled veterans. We need solutions that work for all of them." The challenge was immense, but Sarah saw an opportunity that even the War Department hadn't fully recognized. What if we approach this like military training? Each veteran receives basic prosthetic systems, but then specializes in particular applications based on their career goals and aptitudes. Colonel Whitaker's expression showed growing excitement, like military occupational specialties. Veterans would master prosthetic systems optimized for their chosen trades: carpentry, machining, farming, clerical work. "Exactly," Thomas added. "We'd create specialized training programs for each occupation, with prosthetic systems designed specifically for those work requirements. Veterans would graduate as certified specialists in their fields." Dr. Stevenson was already envisioning the broader implications. This could revolutionize how we think about disability in civilian society. Instead of seeing prosthetics as medical devices, we'd see them as professional tools. The meeting concluded with an agreement to develop a pilot program that would test the concept with 100 veterans representing 10 different occupational specialties. If successful, the program would be expanded to serve all disabled veterans nationwide. As Thomas and Sarah prepared to leave Washington, General Morrison made one final observation that would prove prophetic. "You came here thinking you were selling prosthetics to the government. But what you're actually doing is helping us reimagine what American veterans can accomplish." The train ride back to Nebraska gave them time to absorb the magnitude of what they had committed to undertaking. The War Department contract would transform their small manufacturing operation into a major industrial enterprise, their individual approach to prosthetic fitting into a comprehensive rehabilitation system, and their personal triumph over tragedy into a national model for human potential. "We're not just building prosthetics anymore," Sarah said as they watched the winter landscape roll past their window. "We're building a new understanding of what people can achieve when society stops seeing disability as limitation and starts seeing it as opportunity for enhancement." Thomas nodded, already mentally designing the expanded facilities they would need. "The question is whether we can scale our approach without losing the personal attention that makes it work. The answer would determine not just their own future, but the future of thousands of veterans whose lives hung in the balance between despair and renewed purpose. The farm accident that had seemed like an ending was becoming the beginning of a transformation that would reshape American society's understanding of human potential. 5 years after the accident that changed everything, Sarah Mitchell stood before the largest gathering of medical professionals, engineers, and rehabilitation specialists in American history. The auditorium of the Smithsonian Institution was packed with over 800 attendees who had come to witness the presentation of the first comprehensive study on prosthetic rehabilitation outcomes, a study that would fundamentally alter how society understood human potential. The woman who took the stage bore little resemblance to the farm wife who had lost her arms in a threshing machine accident. Sarah's prosthetic attachments moved with fluid precision as she adjusted the microphone, her custom-designed presentation tools allowing her to manipulate slides and demonstrations with capabilities that exceeded those of natural hands. But more than her technical proficiency, it was her commanding presence that captured the audience's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast auditorium, "I want to tell you about a revolution that began with a catastrophe and became a transformation that has touched thousands of lives." Behind her, a massive screen displayed photographs of the pilot program veterans, 100 men and women who had become the first participants in the comprehensive prosthetic rehabilitation system that had emerged from the War Department partnership. But these weren't medical photographs showing clinical results. They were portraits of Americans at work: a former artillery officer now crafting precision instruments, a wounded Marine operating heavy machinery, an Army engineer teaching mathematics at a university. 3 years ago, these veterans were classified as disabled, dependent on government assistance, their productive lives apparently over. Today, they represent the most skilled specialists in their respective trades, with employment rates and income levels that exceed the national average for their professions. Dr. Jonathan Westbrook, the same surgeon who had initially treated Sarah's injuries, sat in the front row with an expression of amazement. The transformation he was witnessing went far beyond anything he'd had imagined possible when he had first told Thomas and Sarah that his wife would never again have the use of her arms. Thomas, now director of the National Institute for Prosthetic Innovation, a federal agency created specifically to oversee the expansion of their rehabilitation model, presented the statistical evidence that supported Sarah's claims. Employment rates among prosthetic rehabilitation program graduates, 94%. Average income increase over pre-injury levels, 23%. User satisfaction ratings, 98%. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The real transformation was visible in the faces of the veterans themselves, 12 of whom had been invited to demonstrate their capabilities for the assembled medical professionals. Master Sergeant Robert Chen, who had lost his right arm at Below Wood, now operated a precision instrument manufacturing company that supplied medical devices to hospitals across the country. His prosthetic attachments allowed him to perform mechanical work with accuracy that surpassed human capability. "Before my injury, I was a good soldier," Chen told the audience as he demonstrated the assembly of a complex chronometer. "After my rehabilitation, I became a master craftsman. The prosthetic doesn't just replace what I lost, it gives me capabilities I never had before." Frank Morrison, the former machinist who had been one of the original clinical trial subjects, had become the chief instructor at the National Prosthetic Training Center. His students, all veterans learning to use advanced prosthetic systems, consistently achieved skill levels that made them the most sought-after workers in their fields. "We don't train people to cope with disability," Morrison explained to the fascinated audience. "We train them to excel beyond what they thought possible. The prosthetic becomes a tool for enhancement, not just replacement." Dr. Anna Hoffman, who had evolved from student to leader of the prosthetic fitting program, presented research that challenged fundamental assumptions about human limitation. Veterans with advanced prosthetic systems demonstrated superior performance in precision tasks, endurance work, and complex problem-solving that required hand-eye coordination. "We're not just helping people overcome disabilities," Dr. Hoffman explained. "We're discovering that the integration of human intelligence with mechanical precision creates capabilities that exceed normal human limits." The presentation reached its climax when Sarah demonstrated the latest innovations in prosthetic technology devices that incorporated feedback systems, allowing users to feel texture and temperature, strength amplification mechanisms that could lift objects weighing hundreds of pounds, and precision controls that could manipulate components smaller than a human hair. "This is my newest hand," Sarah announced, displaying a prosthetic attachment that resembled a work of art as much as a mechanical device. "It incorporates 5 years of user feedback and engineering refinement. Watch carefully." She proceeded to thread a needle while simultaneously lifting a 50-pound weight with her other prosthetic arm, demonstrating the independent control and varied capabilities that the latest systems provided. The audience watched in stunned silence as she then switched to a different attachment and began playing a complex piece of music on a piano, the mechanical fingers moving with fluid grace across the keys. "I can perform tasks today that would have been impossible for me before my accident," Sarah continued. "My prosthetic hands don't fatigue, don't shake, don't lose strength. Combined with human intelligence and training, they represent an enhancement of human capability, not just a replacement for what was lost." The implications of this demonstration rippled through the audience. If prosthetic technology could provide superhuman capabilities, what did that mean for the future of human enhancement? Were they witnessing the early stages of a transformation that would eventually benefit all humans, not just those who had suffered injuries? Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, the German engineer whose early correspondence had helped shape the Mitchell approach, had traveled from Berlin specifically to witness the presentation. During the question period, he stood to address the fundamental philosophical questions that the demonstration had raised. "Mrs. Mitchell, you have proven that prosthetic technology can exceed human capability in specific areas. But what are the broader implications for human society? Are we moving toward a future where mechanical enhancement becomes normal rather than remedial?" Sarah's response revealed the breadth of thinking that had emerged from 5 years of intensive research and development. "Dr. Zimmermann, I believe we're discovering that the boundary between human and machine capability is not fixed. The question isn't whether technology will enhance human potential. It's how we ensure that enhancement serves human flourishing rather than replacing human values." Thomas presented the economic analysis that had convinced government officials to expand the program nationwide. Veterans who completed prosthetic rehabilitation generated an average of $12,000 annually in economic value, more than covering the cost of their training and equipment. The program had transformed from a medical expense into an economic investment that strengthened the entire nation. "We're not just helping individuals," Thomas explained to the audience. "We're demonstrating that what society often sees as limitation can become the foundation for unprecedented capability. The key is approaching challenges with engineering precision rather than accepting them as permanent constraints." The presentation concluded with a film documenting the daily lives of program graduates. The camera followed veterans through their workdays, showing prosthetic users outperforming their colleagues in skilled trades, contributing innovations to their industries, and living lives of independence and purpose that exceeded their pre-injury expectations. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when the film showed Sarah and Thomas working together in their laboratory, developing new prosthetic innovations with a team of engineers and medical professionals. The farm couple whose lives had been shattered by an accident had become leaders of a research enterprise that was reshaping rehabilitation medicine. What we've learned, Sarah said in her closing remarks, is that human potential is not limited by physical capability. It's limited by imagination, determination, and the willingness to approach problems with innovative solutions. The accident that cost me my arms taught us that tragedy can become the foundation for discovery that transforms not just individual lives, but entire societies. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 10 minutes, but the real measure of the presentation's impact would be seen in the decades that followed. Medical schools began incorporating prosthetic engineering into their curricula. Engineering schools established rehabilitation technology programs. The federal government expanded the prosthetic rehabilitation program to serve all Americans with limb loss, not just veterans. As the audience dispersed, many attendees approached Sarah and Thomas with questions about implementing similar programs in their own institutions. The couple, who had once worked in isolation on their Nebraska farm, found themselves at the center of a movement that was spreading across the country and around the world. Dr. Westbrook, the surgeon who had delivered the devastating prognosis 5 years earlier, waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching Sarah. "Mrs. Mitchell, when I first treated your injuries, I told you that you would never again have the use of your arms. I was wrong about more than just your personal recovery. I was wrong about the nature of human limitation itself." Sarah smiled, her prosthetic hand extending to shake his with perfect precision. "Dr. Westbrook, you weren't wrong about the medical reality of my situation. You were limited by the medical possibilities available at the time. What we've learned is that possibilities can be expanded through innovation and determination." As evening fell over Washington, Thomas and Sarah walked together through the city streets, their prosthetic and natural hands intertwined. The farm accident that had seemed like an ending had become the beginning of a transformation that would continue long after their own lives had ended. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if the safety guard hadn't failed that day? Thomas asked as they paused to watch the sunset paint the Capitol dome in golden light. Sarah considered the question that had haunted both of them in the early days after the accident. "I think about it sometimes, but I also think about all the people whose lives have been changed because it did fail. The veterans who found new purpose, the families who regained their providers, the society that learned to see limitation as opportunity for innovation." Thomas nodded, understanding that their personal tragedy had become the foundation for discoveries that would benefit generations of Americans. "We set out to solve our own problem. We ended up helping solve a problem that society didn't even know it had." As they continued their walk through the capital city, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them from a Nebraska farm to the corridors of national power. The accident that had cost her both arms had given her something perhaps more valuable: the opportunity to prove that human potential knows no bounds when combined with love, determination, and the willingness to innovate beyond conventional limitations. The accident had ended one life and begun another. The second life, built on the foundation of the first, had become a legacy that would inspire innovations in human enhancement for generations to come. And it had all started with a farm wife who refused to accept that losing her arms meant losing her future, and an engineer who refused to accept that any problem was impossible to solve. Their story became America's story, a testament to the power of human resilience and the unlimited potential that emerges when tragedy becomes the catalyst for transformation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.